Welcome to the PrepNet, presented every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Talk to Me's Channel 14. Come join us to discuss everything about prepping and hear what others have done. We will talk about radio antennas because there is a lot of incorrect information out there. We will focus primarily on the HF bands, which would be the ham and CB bands. There are many tuned commercial antennas available for GMRS and POC radios, so those antennas will not be covered in this discussion. Just be careful what antennas you attach to your radios. Let us start with a quick question for everyone. If you had to choose, would you rather have a $2,000 radio connected to a poor antenna or an average radio connected to an excellent antenna? Many experienced operators will tell you the second option will usually perform better. The radio itself matters, but the antenna is just as important as the radio connected to it. What an antenna actually does. A radio transmitter produces radio frequency energy. The antenna's job is to take that electrical energy from the radio and launch it into the air as a radio wave. When another antenna receives that wave, it converts the energy back into electrical signals that the receiving radio can understand. In simple terms, the radio creates the signal. The antenna launches the signal. A useful way to remember this is, radios create signals, but antennas send them into the air. If the antenna does not work efficiently, much of the radio's power never leaves the station. This is why antennas are often the most important part of a radio system. Understanding wavelength. Radio signals travel through the air as electromagnetic waves. Each frequency produces a wave with a specific physical length called its wavelength. Higher frequencies produce shorter waves. Lower frequencies produce longer waves. A simple rule many operators remember is, as frequency goes down, antenna length goes up. Antennas work best when their length is related to the wavelength of the signal being transmitted. For example, on the 2-meter amateur band, a full wavelength is about 2 meters long. A quarter-wave antenna, which is the baseline for antennas, for that band, is roughly 19 inches long. When an antenna length matches the wavelength properly, the radio signal can leave the antenna efficiently. The football field antenna analogy. Here is a quick way to visualize how large lower-frequency antennas can become. A typical American football field is 300 feet long from goal line to goal line. An 80-meter band signal around 3.8 megahertz has a full wavelength of roughly 255 feet. That means a full wavelength antenna for that band would stretch almost the entire length of a football field. A quarter-wave dipole would still be around 64 feet long. Comparing wavelengths, that football field would have one 3.8 megahertz wave along its length. While about 45 2-meter waves would fit in that same football field, and at GMRS frequencies, you could fit roughly 140 waves in that space. This happens because higher frequencies have shorter wavelengths, so more waves can fit into the same physical distance. The higher the frequency, the more line of sight they have, which limits their range. This comparison helps illustrate why HF antennas are often physically large. Why antenna length affects performance. When the antenna length matches the intended wavelength, most of the radio energy radiates outward. When the antenna is poorly matched to the wavelength, some of the energy reflects toward the radio. This reduces the strength of the transmitted signal. Garden hose analogy. Think about a garden hose. When the hose is straight and unobstructed, water flows smoothly out the end. If the hose is kinked, pressure pushes back through the hose instead of flowing forward. Another way to picture this is with a balloon filled with air. If the air pressure builds inside the balloon and you release the end while holding it, the air rushes backward toward you. A poorly matched antenna behaves the same way. Instead of all the radio energy leaving the antenna, some of it pushes back toward the transmitter. What is SWR? SWR stands for Standing Wave Ratio. It is a measurement of how well the antenna system matches the radio and the feed line. SWR measures how much of the transmitted signal is being reflected back toward the transmitter instead of being radiated by the antenna. A detailed discussion of SWR is beyond the scope of this lesson. If enough people are interested, a separate video could be made explaining SWR in greater detail. Coax cable loss. The coax cable that connects the radio to the antenna is called the feed line. Coax cable does not transfer power perfectly. A small amount of signal power is lost as the signal travels through the cable. This is called coax loss or feed line loss. The longer the coax cable, the more signal loss occurs. Higher radio frequencies also experience more coax loss than lower frequencies. For example, a very long coax run on UHF can lose a significant amount of transmitter power before the signal ever reaches the antenna. This means that even if the radio is producing full power, the antenna may actually receive much less. Poor quality coax cable or damaged connectors can increase this loss even more. Because of this, operators try to keep coax runs reasonably short, use good quality coax cable, install connectors properly. Even a well-tuned antenna cannot perform well if a large amount of signal power is being lost in the coax cable. 100 watts at the radio. Example: imagine a radio transmitting 100 watts of power. If the coax cable has significant loss, only part of that power may reach the antenna. For example, a long run of lossy coax might deliver only about 60 watts to the antenna. The remaining 40 watts is lost as heat in the coax cable before the signal ever reaches the antenna. As a side note, losing 40 watts from a 100-watt transmitter is significant. However, when a POC radio transmits only about half a watt, such a loss would be extremely serious. Antenna height and location. One of the biggest improvements an operator can make is increasing antenna height. Higher antennas usually perform better because the signal encounters fewer obstacles, such as buildings, trees, and terrain. Many experienced operators use a simple saying, "height is might." Improving antenna height often produces better results than increasing transmitter power. Antenna polarization, vertical versus horizontal. Another important antenna characteristic is polarization. Polarization refers to the orientation of the antenna element and the radio wave it produces. The two most common types are vertical polarization and horizontal polarization. A vertical antenna stands upright. Examples include mobile antennas, handheld antennas, and many base vertical antennas. A horizontal antenna is mounted parallel to the ground. A common example is a horizontal dipole stretched between two trees. Signals are usually received best when the transmitting and receiving antennas use the same polarization. Vertical antennas work best with other vertical antennas. Horizontal antennas work best with other horizontal antennas. When one antenna is vertical and the other is horizontal, the signal can be significantly weaker. In some cases, the signal loss can be 20 decibels or more, which represents about a 99% reduction in signal power. Understanding antenna polarization helps explain why some stations hear each other better than others, even when using the same frequency and power. Handheld radio example. Most handheld radios come with a short, flexible antenna, often called a rubber duck antenna. These antennas are convenient but are a compromised design. Replacing the rubber duck with a longer quarter-wave antenna usually results in stronger signals, better receive performance, greater communication range. Base station example. A base station radio connected to a properly mounted outdoor antenna will usually outperform a handheld radio, even if both radios use the same transmit power. A handheld inside a building may reach only a few miles. The same radio connected to a roof-mounted antenna may reach repeaters 20 to 40 miles away, depending on terrain. The difference lies in the antenna system, not in the transmitter power. 5 common antenna mistakes. Mistake 1. Using the wrong antenna for the frequency band. For example, using a CB antenna on a VHF radio. Mistake 2. Mounting the antenna too low or indoors. Mistake 3. Using damaged or poor quality coax cable. Mistake 4. Not checking SWR after installing a new antenna. Mistake 5. Standing too close to the antenna while transmitting with handheld radios. Avoiding these mistakes can dramatically improve radio performance. Visualizing HF antenna sizes. A quick way to picture HF antenna sizes is to compare them to everyday spaces. A 10-meter band antenna, operating roughly in the 28 to 29.7 MHz frequency range, might be about the length of a small room. A 20-meter dipole, operating roughly in the 14.0 to 14.35 MHz frequency range, can stretch across the width of many houses. A 40-meter dipole, operating roughly in the 7.0 to 7.3 MHz frequency range, may span most of a backyard. An 80-meter dipole, operating roughly in the 3.5 to 4 MHz frequency range, can be well over 100 feet long and often requires 2 tall trees or large supports. This comparison helps explain why higher frequency antennas are easier to install and why lower frequency HF antennas often require much more space. The $20 antenna versus the $2,000 radio. Here is a short story many experienced operators like to share. Operator 1 buys a very expensive radio that costs $2,000. However, the operator connects it to a small, inefficient antenna mounted indoors. Operator 2 buys a basic radio and spends time installing a simple wire dipole antenna outside between 2 trees. That wire antenna may cost less than $20 to build. When both operators get on the air, the second operator is often heard more clearly and over greater distances. The reason is simple. The second operator invested effort in the antenna system. The first operator invested only in the radio. This example highlights one of the most common lessons in radio communication. A modest radio with an excellent antenna will usually outperform an expensive radio connected to a poor antenna. Closing. We discussed how antennas work and why they are such an important part of any radio station. An antenna converts electrical energy from the transmitter into radio waves that travel through the air. When the antenna is properly matched and tuned, most of the transmitter's power leaves the antenna and becomes a useful signal. When the antenna is mismatched, power reflects back toward the radio and efficiency is reduced. This is what SWR measures. Improving the antenna system often produces greater results than increasing transmitter power or buying a more expensive radio. Understanding these basic antenna principles, including antenna length, tuning, coax feedline quality, antenna height, and polarization, allows operators to get the best performance from their equipment. So just don't throw up any old antenna. Use a properly tuned antenna for the frequency you are on to get the best comms you can. If you have any questions about what we have discussed here tonight, please send your question to prepnetch14@gmail.com and enter question in the subject line.